Aisha Khalid adjusted the strap of her leather laptop bag. As she stepped into the bustling chaos of John F. Kennedy International Airport, the terminal buzzed with the usual symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and hurried footsteps. At 32, Aisha was no stranger to airports. Her job as a marketing consultant for a tech firm in Boston meant frequent flights, and JFK was a familiar stop on her route to client meetings. Today, she was headed to Chicago for a pitch that could secure a major contract. Her navy blazer was crisp, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her carry-on was meticulously packed. Everything about her screamed professionalism. But as she approached the security checkpoint, a familiar unease settled in her stomach. The line snaked through a maze of stanchions, and Aisha joined it, pulling out her boarding pass and ID. She glanced at her watch, 6:45 a.m. Her flight boarded in an hour, leaving just enough time to grab a coffee after clearing security. The crowd around her was a cross-section of New York's diversity business travelers in suits, families with restless kids, tourists clutching guidebooks. Aisha blended in, or so she thought. Her parents had immigrated from Jordan before she was born, and she'd grown up in a Boston suburb, navigating the world as an American with a name and complexion that sometimes drew extra scrutiny. She was used to it, the lingering glances, the occasional random screening, but it never stopped stinging. As she neared the front of the line, a TSA officer barked instructions. Shoes off, laptops out, liquids in a bag. Aisha complied, placing her belongings in a gray bin. She stepped toward the body scanner, arms raised, as the machine whirred. On the other side, a stocky officer with a crew cut motioned her forward. His badge read M. Reynolds. Aisha collected her bag and was about to slip on her flats when he raised a hand. "Ma'am, step over here," he said, his tone flat but edged with authority. Aisha froze, her heart rate ticking up. She followed him to a small table where another officer stood, arms crossed. The second officer, a younger woman, avoided eye contact, focusing on a clipboard. "Is something wrong?" Aisha asked, keeping her voice steady. Reynolds didn't answer right away. He unzipped her carry-on and began rifling through it, pulling out her laptop, a notebook, and a small toiletry bag. "We need to do a secondary screening," he said, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. There was something in his gaze, cold, almost challenging, that made her skin prickle. Aisha nodded, though her mind raced. She'd been through this before, but it felt different this time. The way Reynolds moved, deliberate and slow, seemed designed to unsettle her. He opened her toiletry bag and held up a tube of moisturizer, squinting at the label as if it were evidence of a crime. "Traveling alone?" he asked. "Yes," Aisha said, her throat dry. "Business trip. Where to?" He pressed, setting the moisturizer down and picking up her passport. He flipped through it, lingering on the stamps from Dubai and Amman, trips she'd taken to visit family. "Chicago," she answered, forcing herself to stay calm. The line behind her had slowed, and she could feel eyes on her other passengers, curious or impatient, watching the scene unfold. Reynolds smirked, a faint curl of his lip. "Chicago, huh? Long way from the Middle East." His voice was low, but the words hit like a slap. Aisha's breath caught. She glanced at the female officer, hoping for some sign of discomfort or intervention, but the woman kept her head down, scribbling on her clipboard. "Excuse me," Aisha said, her voice sharper now. "What's that supposed to mean?" Reynolds didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his hands still on her belongings. "Just making conversation. You know how it has gotta be thorough with certain folks." He emphasized certain, his eyes locked. On hers, the implication was clear, and it burned. Aisha's face grew hot, a mix of anger and humiliation. She wanted to snap back, to demand an explanation, but the power dynamic was stark. He had the badge, the authority, and she was just a passenger, vulnerable and exposed. Her mind flashed to stories she'd read, people detained for hours, questioned over nothing, their dignity stripped away. She thought of her parents, who'd taught her to keep her head down in moments like this, to avoid trouble. But another part of her, the part that had fought for her place in boardrooms and navigated microaggressions her whole life, refused to stay silent. She reached into her blazer pocket, where her phone sat, and discreetly pressed the record button. She wasn't sure what she'd do with the footage, but she needed proof. Something to anchor this moment in reality. Reynolds continued his search, now pulling out a scarf she'd packed. "What's this for?" he asked, holding it up like it was suspicious. "It's a scarf," Aisha said, her voice tight. "For the plane. It gets cold." He snorted, tossing it onto the table right. "Gotta stay warm." His tone dripped with sarcasm, and he exchanged a glance with the other officer, who offered a faint smile. Aisha's grip on her phone tightened. She angled it slightly, making sure the camera caught his face, his badge, the way he handled her things with careless disdain. The screening dragged on for 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. Reynolds asked more questions: where she worked, why she was traveling, whether she'd been to certain countries recently. Each question was a jab, probing not just her itinerary but her identity. Aisha answered curtly, her anger simmering but controlled. Finally, he zipped up her bag and shoved it toward her. "You're good. For now," he said, the last 2 words heavy with menace. Aisha gathered her things, her hands trembling slightly. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, the recording still running. As she walked toward her gate, the weight of what had happened settled over her. She felt violated, singled out not for anything she'd done, but for who she was. The terminal's noise faded into a dull hum, and her thoughts spiraled. Should she report it? To whom? Would it matter? She thought of the video on her phone, a digital witness to her humiliation. Sharing it could expose Reynolds, but it could also invite scrutiny, backlash, maybe even danger. She'd seen how people who spoke out were often vilified, their lives dissected online. At a coffee kiosk, she ordered a latte, more to steady herself than because she wanted it. She sat at a small table near her gate, staring at her phone. The recording was there, 12 minutes of audio and shaky video, capturing Reynolds's words, his smirk, the way he'd made her feel small. Aisha's finger hovered over the share button. She imagined her parents' voices, urging caution, and her best friend Maya's, telling her to fight. The boarding call for her flight crackled over the speakers, pulling her back to the present. She had a pitch to deliver, a job to do. But as she stood, slipping her phone into her bag, she knew this wasn't over. Something had shifted inside her, a resolve hardening. Whatever she decided, this moment would change everything. Aisha sat in her Chicago hotel room, the glow of her laptop casting shadows across the neatly made bed. It was 9:17 p.m., and the city's skyline twinkled through the window. But her focus was on the screen. The video from JFK Airport, now edited to a crisp 10 minutes, sat in a draft post on her social media account. She'd spent the flight replaying the incident in her mind. Mark Reynolds' smirk, his pointed questions, the way he'd made her feel like an outsider in her own country. The memory churned her stomach, but it also fueled a quiet fury. She'd decided to share the video, not out of impulsiveness, but from a growing conviction that silence would only protect people like Reynolds. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She'd written the caption, revised it 3 times, and now stared at the final version. "This happened to me at JFK this morning. I was singled out and humiliated by a TSA officer because of my background. This isn't just my story, it's too many people's. We deserve better." She attached the video, which showed Reynolds' face clearly, his badge number visible, and his words unmistakable. Aisha hesitated, her pulse quickening. Posting this would open a door she couldn't close. She thought of her parents, who'd always cautioned her against drawing attention, and her colleagues, who might see this as unprofessional. But then she thought of the next person Reynolds might target, someone who might not have a phone or the nerve to record. She clicked post. The first hour was quiet. Aisha showered, changed into pajamas, and checked her phone. A few likes, a handful of comments, mostly from friends expressing shock and support. "That's awful, Aisha," her college roommate wrote. "You okay?" her cousin in Ammon messaged. "This is why I hate traveling there." She replied to a few, her responses measured, but her eyes kept darting to the notification count. By 10:30 p.m., the post had 100 shares. By midnight, it was 1,000. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, vibrating against the nightstand. She muted it, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the dark, watching the numbers climb, a mix of validation and dread settling in her chest. By morning, the post had exploded. Aisha woke to 47,000 shares and a flood of notifications. Her inbox was crammed with messages, some from strangers offering solidarity, others from reporters requesting interviews. She scrolled through the comments, her heart racing. "This is disgusting. Thank you for speaking out," one read. "TSA needs to fire this guy," said another. But there were others, sharper and crueler. "You're exaggerating. He was just doing his job," one user wrote. "Why do you people always play the victim?" another sneered, the words laced with venom. Aisha's hands trembled as she read, each hateful comment a small cut. She'd expected pushback, but the volume was overwhelming, a reminder of how quickly a personal stand could become a public battle. She called Maya, her best friend since high school, who answered on the first ring. "Aisha, you're viral," Maya said, her voice a mix of awe and concern. "I saw the video. That guy's a prick. You okay?" Aisha exhaled, grateful for the familiar voice. "I don't know. It's a lot. People are saying horrible things." Maya's tone hardened. "Screw them. You did the right thing. This is bigger than you now." They talked for an hour, Maya urging her to stay focused, to not let the trolls win. Aisha hung up feeling steadier, but the weight of the moment lingered. At her client meeting that morning, Aisha struggled to concentrate. Her phone, now on silent, lit up with notifications. Her boss, Karen, had texted, "Saw your post. Let's discuss when you're back. Focus on the pitch for now." The message was neutral, but Aisha sensed an undercurrent of caution. She delivered the pitch, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind, and the clients seemed impressed. But as she left the meeting, her phone buzzed with a voicemail from a local news outlet. "We'd like to speak with you about your experience at JFK," the reporter said. Aisha saved the message, unsure if she was ready for that spotlight. Back at the hotel, she checked the post again. It had reached 2 million views. A grassroots activist group had shared it, adding a call to action: demand accountability from JFK and TSA. "This stops now." Aisha followed the group and found messages from its organizers offering support and legal advice. One name stood out: Sarah Chen, a civil rights lawyer based in New York. "Your video is powerful," Sarah wrote. "If you want to pursue this, I can help. No pressure, just options." Aisha saved the message, her mind racing. A formal complaint could mean real consequences for Reynolds, but it would also mean diving deeper into a fight she hadn't planned for. The online response grew more polarized. Supporters started a petition for Reynolds' termination, which gained 10,000 signatures in hours. But a counter-narrative emerged, with some claiming Aisha had provoked the incident or edited the video to mislead. A few accounts posted her LinkedIn profile, accusing her of seeking attention to boost her career. Aisha's stomach churned as she read the accusations, each one chipping away at her resolve. She thought of deleting the post, of retreating to the safety of anonymity. But the messages of support kept her grounded. A woman named Fatima wrote, "I went through the same thing at Lax. Thank you for giving us a voice." Aisha read it twice, tears welling up. That evening, she replied to Sarah's message, agreeing to a call the next day. She also drafted a follow-up post addressing the backlash. "I didn't post this for fame or drama," she wrote. "I posted it because no one should feel unsafe traveling. Thank you to everyone standing with me." She hesitated, then hit post. Within minutes, the comments poured in, a mix of encouragement and vitriol. Aisha closed her laptop, her head throbbing. She thought of Reynolds, wondering if he'd seen the video, if he felt any remorse. She thought of her parents, who didn't yet know what she'd done. And she thought of the thousands of strangers now carrying her story forward, their voices amplifying hers in ways she couldn't have imagined. As she packed for her return flight, Aisha felt the weight of her decision. The video had sparked something unstoppable, a wave she could neither control nor escape. She checked her phone one last time before bed. The petition had 20,000 signatures, and a major news outlet had picked up the story. Her name, her face, her pain, they were no longer just hers. They belonged to the world now, and whatever came next, Aisha knew she'd have to face it head-on. Aisha Khalid sat in a small coffee shop near her Boston apartment, her phone face down on the table to avoid the constant buzz of notifications. It was 3 days since she'd posted the video of her encounter with TSA officer Mark Reynolds at JFK Airport, and the world seemed to have tilted on its axis. The video had surpassed 10 million views, shared across platforms by activists, influencers, and everyday people. News outlets from local stations to national networks had picked up the story, with headlines like "Passenger alleges racial profiling at JFK," and viral video sparks outrage over TSA conduct. Aisha's name was everywhere, her face plastered on screens and newsstands. She felt exposed, like a nerve laid bare, but there was no turning back. The coffee shop was a refuge, its low hum of conversation and clinking mugs a temporary shield from the chaos. Aisha sipped her latte, glancing at the laptop open before her. Her inbox was a war zone, hundreds of messages, some offering support, others dripping with hate. One email, from a woman named Maria in Texas, read, "I was profiled at an airport too. Your courage is inspiring." Another, from an anonymous sender, called her a troublemaker and warned her to watch her back. Aisha deleted the latter, her jaw tight, but the words lingered. She'd expected backlash, but its intensity was relentless, a reminder of how quickly a personal stand could become a lightning rod. Her meeting with Sarah Chen, the civil rights lawyer, was scheduled for that afternoon. Aisha had spoken to Sarah briefly the night before, a 20-minute call that left her cautiously optimistic. Sarah was sharp, empathetic, and direct, outlining the steps for filing a formal complaint with the TSA and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which oversaw JFK. "This won't be quick or easy," Sarah had warned, "but your video is evidence, and the public response gives us leverage." Aisha had agreed to move forward, though the prospect of a legal battle made her stomach churn. She wasn't a crusader, just a woman who'd refused to stay silent. Yet here she was, at the center of a movement she hadn't meant to start. The public response was a double-edged sword. The petition demanding Reynolds' termination had swelled to 50,000 signatures, and a #free campaign had emerged, with supporters sharing their own stories of airport discrimination. Aisha read them late at night, each one a gut punch: a black man detained for suspicious behavior that amounted to carrying a laptop, a Sikh woman forced to remove her turban in public, a Latino family questioned about their citizenship. The stories validated her decision to speak out, but they also weighed on her, a reminder of how widespread the problem was. She felt a responsibility to these strangers, as if her voice now carried theirs too. But the backlash was just as fierce. Online, a vocal minority painted her as an opportunist, accusing her of fabricating the incident for clout. A few right-wing blogs ran pieces claiming the video was deceptively edited, though Aisha had posted the raw footage to counter the narrative. Comment sections were battlegrounds, with supporters and detractors trading barbs. One user, whose profile picture was a bald eagle, wrote, "She's just mad she got caught. TSA keeps us safe." Another called her ungrateful for criticizing the country that gave her a home. Aisha tried to ignore them, but the vitriol seeped into her thoughts, making her question herself. Had she overreacted? Was she ready for this fight? Her employer's response added another layer of stress. Karen, her boss, had called that morning, her tone professional but strained. "Aisha, we support you, but this is delicate," she'd said. "Clients are asking questions. Just keep us in the loop." Aisha understood the subtext. Her activism could jeopardize the firm's reputation. She'd worked hard to climb the corporate ladder, earning respect in a field where she was often the only woman of color in the room. The thought of her career taking a hit was sobering, but she couldn't unring the bell. The video was out there, and so was her truth. The airport's response was equally tepid. The Port Authority had issued a statement the previous day, posted to their website, and shared with media. "We are aware of the incident at JFK and are conducting a thorough investigation. We take allegations of misconduct seriously and are committed to ensuring a safe and respectful environment for all travelers." It was boilerplate, carefully worded to avoid admitting fault. Aisha had read it with a mix of frustration and resolve. An investigation was a start, but she wanted more accountability for Reynolds, yes, but also systemic change to prevent others from enduring what she had. Her phone vibrated. pulling her back to the present. It was a text from Maya, her best friend. "Check the news. They're talking about you on CNN." Aisha opened her laptop and navigated to the network's website. A live segment was streaming, with a panel discussing her video. A former TSA official defended the agency, arguing that officers faced immense pressure to maintain security. A civil rights advocate countered, citing data on disproportionate screenings of minority travelers. Aisha watched, her chest tight. As her name flashed across the chyron, it was surreal, hearing strangers debate her life as if it were a case study. The segment ended, and Aisha closed the laptop, her coffee now cold. She thought of her parents, who'd called the night before, their voices heavy with worry. "Why did you post it, Aisha?" her mother had asked. "You're putting a target on your back." Her father, usually stoic, had added, "We just want you safe." Aisha had reassured them, but their fear lingered in her mind. She hadn't told them about the meeting with Sarah yet, knowing it would only heighten their anxiety. They'd spent their lives teaching her to navigate prejudice quietly, to survive by blending in. This go in public, fighting back, was uncharted territory for all of them. At 2 p.m., Aisha arrived at Sarah's office, a modest space in downtown Boston cluttered with legal books and framed awards. Sarah, in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and a warm smile, greeted her with a handshake. "You're holding up better than most would," she said, gesturing to a chair. Aisha managed a small laugh. "Doesn't feel like it." They spent 2 hours reviewing the complaint process, with Sarah explaining the TSA's internal review system and the potential for a federal lawsuit if the agency stonewalled. She also mentioned the possibility of a settlement, though Aisha bristled at the idea. "This isn't about money," she said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Sarah nodded. "I hear you. Let's start with the complaint and see where it takes us." As they drafted the document, Sarah shared sobering statistics. In 2024, the TSA had received over 1,200 complaints of alleged discrimination, but fewer than 10% resulted in disciplinary action. "The system protects its own," Sarah said. "But your video changes the game. They can't ignore this kind of public pressure." Aisha nodded, though the numbers were daunting. She thought of Reynolds, wondering if he was sweating yet. That morning, a news report had confirmed he was suspended pending the investigation. A small victory that felt hollow without broader change. Leaving Sarah's office, Aisha felt a mix of determination and exhaustion. The complaint would be filed the next day, and Sarah had promised to handle media inquiries to shield her from the frenzy. But the emotional toll was mounting. Aisha hadn't slept properly in days, her mind replaying the incident, the comments, the news segments. She walked to her car, the autumn air crisp against her skin, and checked her phone. A new message from the activist group she'd connected with online read. "We're organizing a protest at JFK this weekend. Will you speak?" Aisha stared at the words, her heart pounding. Speaking publicly would escalate things further, but it could also amplify the call for change. She typed a reply, "Let me think about it," and hit send. Back home, Aisha cooked dinner, a simple pasta dish, hoping the routine would ground her. But as she ate, her phone lit up with a breaking news alert. TSA officer in viral video has history of complaints. Sources say. Aisha's fork froze midair. The article, published by a major outlet, cited anonymous TSA employees who claimed Reynolds had been flagged for inappropriate conduct multiple times but never disciplined. Aisha's anger flared anew. How had he been allowed to continue? The revelation fueled her resolve, but it also deepened her unease. If the system had protected Reynolds before, what would it take to dismantle that shield? She went to bed that night with her laptop open, reading messages from supporters. One, from a high school teacher in Chicago, read, "I showed your video to my students. They're inspired to stand up for what's right." Aisha smiled, the words a small light in the darkness. But as she drifted to sleep, the hateful comments echoed too, a reminder of the cost of her stand. The fight was just beginning, and Aisha knew she'd need every ounce of strength to see it through. Aisha Khalid stood on a makeshift stage outside Terminal 4 at JFK Airport, her hands gripping the edges of a podium as she faced a crowd of nearly 500 people. It was a crisp Saturday morning, 1 week after her viral video had exposed TSA officer Mark Reynolds' discriminatory behavior. The protest, organized by the grassroots group Citizens for Fair Travel, had drawn a diverse mix of activists, travelers, airport workers, and curious onlookers. Signs bobbed above the crowd, their messages scrawled in bold marker: "End racial profiling at airports. Fire Reynolds now. Travelers deserve respect." Aisha's stomach churned with nerves, but the weight of the moment steadied her. She'd agreed to speak, despite her initial hesitation, because the stories pouring into her inbox, hundreds of accounts of humiliation at security checkpoints, had made it clear this wasn't just about her anymore. The microphone crackled as she leaned forward, her breath visible in the cool air. "My name is Aisha Khalid," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. 8 days ago, I was singled out and humiliated by a TSA officer right here at JFK. Not because of anything I did, but because of who I am, the crowd murmured, a ripple of agreement. Aisha recounted the incident, her words deliberate, each one carrying the pain of that morning. She described Reynolds' smirk, his pointed questions about her Middle Eastern background, the way he'd made her feel like a suspect in her own country. "I recorded it because I knew no one would believe me otherwise," she said, "and I shared it because silence lets people like him keep doing this." The crowd erupted in applause, and Aisha paused, scanning their faces. There were people of every age and background: Black, Latino, Asian, white, Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, united by a shared frustration with a system that too often treated them as threats. A woman in a hijab held a sign that read, "My faith is not a crime." A young man with a backpack nodded vigorously, his fist raised. Aisha felt a surge of connection, a sense that her story had cracked open something larger, something unstoppable. She continued, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that lets this happen, that ignores complaints, that protects the wrong people. We need accountability. We need training. We need change." She called for mandatory anti-discrimination training for TSA officers, stricter oversight of complaints, and a public commitment to reform. "Traveling shouldn't mean giving up your dignity," she said. "We deserve better." The crowd roared, chanting, "No more profiling." Aisha stepped back, her heart pounding, as the organizer, a weary man named Jamal, took the mic to lead the next speaker. As she descended the stage, supporters swarmed her, offering handshakes and words of gratitude. A middle-aged woman with tear-streaked cheeks hugged her tightly. "Thank you for speaking for us," she whispered. Aisha nodded, her throat tight, but the moment was fleeting. Reporters pushed through, microphones extended, their questions overlapping. "Aisha, will you sue the TSA? What's next for your campaign?" She answered briefly, repeating her call for systemic change, before Sarah Chen, her lawyer, stepped in to deflect the press. "Ms. Khalid has said what she came to say," Sarah said firmly. "We'll update you as the complaint progresses." The protest stretched into the afternoon, with speeches from other victims of profiling and a performance by a local poet, who wove Aisha's story into a searing critique of systemic bias. Police stood at the perimeter, their presence a quiet reminder of the stakes. Aisha stayed until the end, mingling with attendees, listening to their stories. A retired airport worker, a black man in his 60s, told her he'd seen officers like Reynolds for decades, skating by on connections or union protections. "You're shaking things up, kid," he said, his smile weary but proud. Aisha thanked him, but his words lingered, a reminder of how deep the problem ran behind the scenes. The pressure was mounting. The Port Authority's investigation into Reynolds was ongoing, but leaks to the media revealed a troubling pattern. Anonymous sources confirmed that Reynolds had faced at least 3 prior complaints for inappropriate conduct, including one incident where he'd allegedly mocked a passenger's accent. None had led to discipline, raising questions about the TSA's oversight. Aisha read the reports with a mix of vindication and anger. How many others had suffered because the system shielded him? The news fueled the protests' momentum, with organizers planning similar rallies at airports in Chicago, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. But the spotlight came with costs. Aisha's employer, the tech firm where she worked as a marketing consultant, was growing uneasy. That morning, Karen, her boss, had emailed, "Clients are asking about your involvement in the protests. We need to discuss how this aligns with your role." The message was polite but pointed, a warning that her activism could strain professional relationships. Aisha had replied diplomatically, promising to keep her work separate. But the tension gnawed at her. She'd spent years building her career, navigating corporate spaces where she was often the only woman of color. The thought of losing that ground was a quiet fear, one she hadn't shared even with Maya. Her personal life was straining too. Her parents, still reeling from her decision to go public, had called the night before, their voices thick with concern. "Aisha, this is getting too big," her mother said. "People are outside an airport because of you. What if someone targets you?" Her father, usually reserved, added, "You're our only daughter. We can't lose you." Aisha had reassured them, but their words echoed as she drove home from the protest, the city blurring past her window. She felt torn between her duty to her family and the momentum of the movement, between her own safety and the need to push forward. Online, the narrative was fracturing. Supporters continued to rally, with the petition for Reynolds' termination nearing 100,000 signatures. But detractors grew. Bolder, their attacks more personal. A conservative talk show host had devoted a segment to Aisha, calling her a professional victim who'd weaponized her identity for fame. Commenters piled on, some questioning her citizenship, others digging into her social media for ammunition. One post, like thousands of times, shared a photo of Aisha at a college protest years ago, captioned, "She's been at this for years." Aisha saw it and felt a pang of violation, as if her past were being ransacked to discredit her present. Sarah had warned her about this. "The louder you get, the harder they'll try to tear you down," she'd said during a strategy call. Sarah was preparing a second complaint, this one targeting the TSA's broader practices, citing data on disproportionate screenings of minority travelers. She'd also connected Aisha with a media trainer to handle the growing press attention. "You're a symbol now," Sarah said. "That's power, but it's also a burden." Aisha nodded, but the word symbol sat heavy. She didn't want to be a figurehead, just a person who'd done what felt right. That evening, Aisha sat in her apartment, the TV muted on a news channel replaying clips from the protest. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jamal. "You killed it today. We're planning a national day of action." Aisha stared at the screen, her mind racing. Joining a national campaign would mean diving deeper, sacrificing more of her privacy, her time, her energy. She thought of the woman at the protest, the one who'd hugged her, and the retired worker who'd called her kid. She thought of Reynolds, still on paid leave, and the system that had let him slide for years. She typed a reply, "Count me in," and hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she opened her laptop, where a draft statement waited. She'd been working on it since the protest, a call for other airports to adopt JFK's reforms, whatever they might be. She added a line about the day's rally, thanking the crowd for their courage. "This is our fight," she wrote, "and we're just getting started." She saved the draft, her eyes heavy. The road ahead was daunting, but as she closed her laptop, Aisha felt a quiet resolve. The protest had shown her the power of collective anger, and she wasn't alone anymore. Aisha Khalid sat in a dimly lit conference room in downtown Manhattan, her laptop open to a spreadsheet tracking complaints, filed through the Citizens for Fair Travel hotline. It was late August, 3 months since her viral video had exposed TSA officer Mark Reynolds' discriminatory behavior. At JFK Airport, the movement she'd sparked had grown into a national force, with protests, petitions, and policy changes reshaping the conversation around airport security. But today, Aisha felt the weight of it all. Her inbox overflowed with stories of profiling. Her phone buzzed with media requests, and her personal life teetered under the strain. The conference room, borrowed from a local advocacy group, was a temporary refuge, its quiet hum a contrast to the chaos outside. The past week had been a turning point. The Port Authority had announced Reynolds' termination, a decision made public after a month-long investigation that confirmed his pattern of unprofessional conduct. Aisha had read the statement on her phone during a layover in Chicago, her heart racing with a mix of relief and vindication. The firing was a victory, but it felt incomplete. Reynolds was one man. The system that had enabled him remained largely untouched. Still, the news had galvanized supporters, with the petition for broader TSA reforms surging past 150,000 signatures. Social media buzzed with messages of triumph. Though Aisha noticed a shift, people weren't just celebrating, they were demanding more. Inspired to share their own stories, the hotline, launched after the JFK protest, was flooded with reports. Aisha scrolled through the spreadsheet, each row a snapshot of pain. A black woman in Atlanta questioned about her hair products. A Sikh man in Seattle forced to remove his turban. A Latino family in Miami detained for inconsistent documentation. The stories echoed her own, and Aisha felt a duty to each one. She'd spent hours with Sarah Chen, her lawyer, and Jamal, the protest organizer, strategizing how to amplify these voices. They'd begun connecting victims with pro bono attorneys, a slow but growing effort to seek justice case by case. Aisha had also started drafting a report, compiling the data to present to policymakers. The numbers were stark. 68% of hotline complaints involved passengers of color, and 85% described humiliating treatment. She hoped the report would pressure the TSA into deeper reforms. The public response was a tidal wave. Major news outlets had covered Reynolds' firing, with some crediting Aisha's video as the catalyst. A CNN segment featured her testimony from the JFK protest, paired with interviews from other victims. Aisha watched it in her hotel room, her stomach twisting as her face filled the screen. She wasn't used to being a public figure, and the exposure felt like a tightrope walk. Supporters sent messages of gratitude. One, from a teacher in Oakland, read, "My students see you as a role model. Thank you for fighting." But the backlash persisted. Online trolls called her a race baiter, and a conservative podcast claimed she'd ruined a man's life for clout. Aisha tried to tune it out, but the attacks were a constant drip, eroding her resilience. Her professional life was another casualty. Her employer, the tech firm, had grown increasingly distant. Karen, her boss, had scheduled a meeting for next week, but the tone of her emails clipped. Formal suggested trouble. Aisha suspected the firm was preparing to let her go, citing her activism as a distraction. The thought was a gut punch. She'd poured years into her career, navigating corporate spaces where she was often the only woman of color. Losing it would mean financial strain and a blow to her identity. She hadn't told her parents, knowing their worry would compound her own. Instead, she confided in Maya, who'd listened over wine at her apartment, her voice fierce. "You're changing the world, Aisha. They don't get to dim that." Aisha clung to those words, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. The movement's expansion brought new challenges. Airports in Chicago, Miami, and San Francisco had announced anti-bias training programs, modeled on JFK's reforms, but implementation was spotty. Aisha had spoken with a whistleblower, a TSA supervisor in Denver, who claimed the training was rushed, with officers treating it as a checkbox. The news frustrated her, but it also spurred her to act. She'd reached out to advocacy groups in those cities, proposing a coordinated push for accountability. The groups agreed, and plans were underway for a National Travelers' Rights Week in October, with rallies and teach-ins to pressure airports for transparency. Aisha was set to keynote the Chicago event, a role that both energized and exhausted her. Her personal toll was mounting. Sleep was elusive, her nights spent scrolling through hotline reports or drafting statements. She'd started having nightmares. Reynolds' face, the checkpoint, a crowd shouting her name. Her parents had noticed her fatigue during a recent visit, their concern palpable. "You're doing too much, Aisha," her mother had said, stirring a pot of lentil soup in her kitchen. "You can't carry everyone." Aisha had nodded, but the words felt hollow. How could she step back when so many were counting on her? Her father, quieter, had slipped her a note before she left. "We're proud, but stay safe." She kept it in her wallet, a talisman against the chaos. The media scrutiny was relentless. Aisha had done a dozen interviews since the firing, each one a balancing act. She emphasized systemic issues training, oversight, complaint handling while deflecting personal questions. But reporters probed, asking about her background, her motives, even her dating life. One outlet had dug up her college transcript, noting she'd minored in sociology, as if it explained her activism. Aisha laughed it off with Sarah, but privately, the invasion stung. She'd hired a media consultant, recommended by Sarah, to manage the deluge. But the consultant's advice, lean into your story, be relatable, felt like a trap. Aisha didn't want to be a brand, she wanted to be heard. Her collaboration with Sarah was a lifeline. They'd filed a second complaint with the Department of Homeland Security, targeting the TSA's broader practices. The complaint cited hotline data and demanded a federal audit. Sarah was optimistic, noting that Reynolds' firing had weakened the agency's defenses. "They're scrambling," she said during a strategy call. "Your movement is forcing their hand." Aisha nodded, but the process was glacial, and she worried about burnout. Sarah sensed it, urging her to delegate. "You're not alone in this," she said. Aisha was trying. She'd recruited to volunteers to manage the hotline, but letting go was hard when every story felt personal. The movement's growth sparked tensions. Some activists wanted to escalate, proposing sit-ins at TSA headquarters, while others, including Aisha, favored policy-focused advocacy. The debate had flared during a Zoom call with coalition leaders, with one member accusing Aisha of playing it safe. She defended her approach, citing the JFK reforms as proof of progress. But the criticism lingered. She wondered if she was losing her edge, if the compromises of leadership were diluting her fire. Jamal, ever steady, reassured her. "You're the glue," he said. "We need your voice." Even when it's messy, Aisha appreciated it. But the pressure to unify was a constant strain. That evening, Aisha attended a fundraiser for the hotline, hosted by a local mosque. The room was packed with community members, their support a bomb. A teenager, inspired by Aisha's story, performed a spoken-word poem about reclaiming dignity. Aisha clapped, tears in her eyes, as the girl bowed. Later, she spoke briefly, thanking the crowd and sharing the hotline's impact. Over 300 cases supported in 2 months. The applause was warm, but as she mingled, a woman approached, her voice low. "I was profiled last week," she said. "Your work helped me file a complaint. It's not over, but I feel seen." Aisha hugged her, the moment grounding her in purpose. Back in the conference room, Aisha closed her laptop. The spreadsheets rose blurring in her vision. She thought of Reynolds, now a fading shadow, and the thousands of stories still untold. She thought of her job, her family, the movement's fractures. The fight was far from won, but as she packed her bag, Aisha felt a flicker of resolve. She'd lost much, but she'd gained something to a community, a cause, a voice that echoed beyond her own. She stepped into the Manhattan night, the city's pulse matching her own, ready for whatever came next. Aisha Khalid stood at a polished wooden podium in a packed New York City Council chamber, her hands steady despite the knot in her stomach. It was a humid June morning, 6 weeks since her viral video had exposed TSA officer Mark Reynolds' discriminatory behavior at JFK Airport. Today, she was testifying at a public hearing on airport security practices, a session spurred by her movement and the nationwide wave of complaints it had unleashed. The room buzzed with energy. Council members in suits, activists with notepads, reporters adjusting cameras, and dozens of supporters who'd come to hear her speak. Aisha adjusted her blazer, her notes neatly typed in front of her, and took a deep breath. This was her chance to push for systemic change, to turn the momentum of protests and petitions into policy. But the weight of expectation, coupled with mounting personal strain, made every word feel like a high-stakes gamble. The hearing was the culmination of weeks of preparation. Sarah Chen, Aisha's lawyer, had spent hours coaching her, drilling down to the core of her message. The TSA's practices disproportionately harmed marginalized travelers, and the system's opacity protected officers like Reynolds. Aisha had pored over data, memorizing statistics that painted a stark picture. In 2024, 72% of TSA complaints involved passengers of color, despite them comprising less than a third of her travelers. Only 8% of those complaints led to disciplinary action, and fewer than 2% resulted in termination. The numbers were damning, But Aisha knew numbers alone wouldn't sway the council. She needed to make it personal, to show the human cost of those statistics. As the council chair called her name, Aisha stepped forward, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. The room quieted, all eyes on her. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear but laced with emotion. "My name is Aisha Khalid, and on May 3, 2025, I was humiliated by a TSA officer at JFK Airport because of my Middle Eastern background." She recounted the incident in vivid detail. Reynolds's smirk, his pointed questions, the way he'd rifled through her scarf as if it were evidence. She described the fear and shame that lingered long after she'd left the checkpoint. "I recorded it because I knew my word wouldn't be enough," she said. "And I shared it because I couldn't let that moment define me or anyone else." The council members listened intently, some jotting notes, others leaning forward. Aisha transitioned to the broader issue, her voice gaining strength. "What happened to me wasn't isolated. It's part of a pattern. Every day, people are profiled at airports because of their race, religion, or nationality. They're questioned, searched, detained, made to feel like criminals for existing." She cited the data, her tone measured but urgent. 72% of complaints come from passengers of color. That's not a coincidence, it's a systemic failure. And when only 8% of those complaints lead to action, the message is clear: the system protects its own over the people it's supposed to serve. Aisha proposed 3 reforms: mandatory anti-bias training with regular evaluations, a public database of anonymized complaints to ensure transparency, and an independent oversight board to review TSA conduct. "These aren't radical ideas," she said. "They're common sense. If we can screen millions of passengers, we can screen our own practices." She closed with a plea. "I'm here because I believe in a world where traveling doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity. You have the power to make that real. Please use it." The room erupted in applause, supporters in the gallery standing to cheer. Aisha exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped back. The council chair thanked her, and the next speaker, a professor of public policy, took the podium. Aisha returned to her seat beside Sarah, who squeezed her arm. "You were incredible," Sarah whispered. Aisha managed a small smile, but her mind was already racing. The testimony was a milestone, but it was only one battle in a war that felt endless. The hearing stretched into the afternoon, with testimony from other victims, advocacy groups, and a TSA representative who offered a polished but vague defense of the agency's robust training protocols. Aisha listened, her frustration mounting. The representative acknowledged her case but framed Reynolds as a bad apple, sidestepping the systemic issues she'd raised. Council members pressed for details on the new JFK training program, but the answers were evasive. Heavy on buzzwords like diversity and inclusion, Aisha scribbled notes, her pen digging into the paper. She'd expected resistance, but the deflection stung. Outside the chamber, the movement was growing. The National Day of Action, planned for next week, had expanded to 15 airports, with Aisha set to speak at the D.C. rally. Citizens for Fair Travel had partnered with major civil rights organizations, creating a coalition that spanned racial and religious lines. Aisha had collaborated with them to draft a federal petition, calling for a Department of Homeland Security audit of TSA practices. The petition had 100,000 signatures and counting, a testament to the movement's reach. But the scale came with challenges: coordinating with activists across time zones, managing media requests, and preparing for D.C. left Aisha stretched thin, her days a blur of meetings and emails. Her personal life was fraying under the strain. Her employer's ultimatum had escalated. The previous day, Karen had called, her voice cold. The client pulled their contract. "Aisha, they cited your public profile as a liability." Aisha's heart had plummeted. The client's account was worth millions, and while Karen didn't fire her, the implication was clear: her job was on the line. Aisha had spent the evening updating her resume, a precaution she hadn't shared with anyone. The thought of losing her career, after years of grinding to prove herself, was a quiet devastation. She'd always prided herself on her independence, but now she felt like she was balancing on a knife's edge. Her family's concerns were another weight. Her parents had watched the hearing livestream, texting her afterward, "You were brave, but please be careful. This is too much," Aisha had called them, trying to ease their fears, but the conversation was strained. Her mother kept circling back to the doxing, the threats, the news vans parked outside their Boston home for a day last month. "We're proud, Aisha, but we're scared," her father admitted. Aisha had no easy answers. She felt torn, wanting to protect them but unable to step away from the fight. The movement had become a part of her, as vital as breathing. The online landscape was a minefield. Supporters hailed her testimony, with clips circulating widely. "Aisha Khalid is a force, one." Commenter wrote, "She's changing the game," but detractors were vicious, their attacks now targeting her character. A viral thread accused her of seeking fame, pointing to her polished appearance at the hearing as proof she was milking the spotlight. Another claimed she'd fabricated the incident, despite the raw footage and Reynolds' firing. Aisha tried to tune it out, but the accusations crept into her thoughts, sowing doubt. Was she doing this for the right reasons? Had she become the professional victim her critics claimed? The criticism reached a new low when a tabloid published a hit piece, digging into her college years and twisting a decade-old photo of her at a Palestinian solidarity rally into evidence of radicalism. The article called her divisive and questioned her loyalty to the U.S. Aisha read it in her apartment, her hands shaking with anger. She forwarded it to Sarah, who was already drafting a defamation countersuit. "They're desperate," Sarah said. "This is what happens when you scare the powerful." Aisha nodded, but the violation was raw, a reminder of how far her critics would go. That evening, Aisha met Jamal and Maria at a Brooklyn diner to plan the D.C. rally. Over coffee and fries, they mapped out logistics, speakers, permits, security. Jamal shared news of a potential ally, a senator who'd expressed interest in sponsoring a bill for TSA oversight. "Your testimony got their attention," he said. Aisha felt a spark of hope, but Maria's next words tempered it. "We're getting pushback too," she said. "Some groups think we're moving too fast, that we should focus on local reforms first." Aisha frowned, sensing the fracture. The movement's growth was its strength, but it risked splintering under competing visions. As she drove home, Aisha's phone buzzed with a voicemail from Maya. "I saw you on TV. You're a badass, but you sound exhausted. Come over this weekend, please. We need wine and bad movies." Aisha smiled, the warmth of Maya's voice a lifeline. She hadn't seen her friend in weeks, their usual brunches replaced by rallies and hearings. She texted back, promising a visit, but as she parked, her thoughts returned to the fight. The hearing had been a step forward, but the TSA's resistance, her job's precariousness, and the movement's growing pains loomed large. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, her keys jingling in the quiet. Inside, she kicked off her shoes and opened her laptop, ready to draft her DC speech. The road was long, but Aisha was in it for the duration, fueled by the voices she carried and the change she could almost touch. Aisha Khalid stood on the balcony of her Boston apartment, a mug of chamomile tea warming her hands as the November sunrise painted the skyline in hues of pink and gold. It was 5 months since her viral video had exposed TSA officer Mark Reynolds' discriminatory behavior at JFK Airport, and the world she inhabited now was unrecognizable from the one she'd known that May morning. The movement she'd sparked had reshaped airport policies, amplified countless voices, and altered the trajectory of her life. Yet, as she gazed at the city waking below, Aisha felt a quiet mix of pride and exhaustion, a sense that her journey had reached a turning point, not an end, but a new kind of beginning. The past months had been a whirlwind. The National Day of Action in July, where Aisha had spoken to a crowd of 2,000 at Reagan National Airport in D.C., had marked a high point. Her speech, calling for federal oversight of TSA practices, had been live-streamed to millions, earning praise from civil rights leaders and a nod from a U.S. senator who later introduced a bill for an independent TSA review board. The bill was still winding through Congress, its fate uncertain, but its existence was a victory Aisha hadn't dared imagine when she'd first posted her video. The movement had grown beyond her, with Citizens for Fair Travel now a registered nonprofit. coordinating advocacy across 20 states. Aisha had stepped back from daily operations, but her name remained synonymous with the cause, a symbol of what one voice could ignite. JFK Airport had implemented its promised reforms, rolling out anti-bias training for 3,000 employees and launching a public complaint portal that anonymized submissions. Early data showed a 15% drop in profiling-related complaints, though Aisha knew the numbers were imperfect. Many incidents still went unreported. Other airports followed suit. Lax O'Hare and Dallas-Fort Worth had adopted similar training programs, citing recent public concerns in their announcements. Aisha read each press release with cautious optimism, aware that change on paper didn't always translate to reality. Still, the shifts were tangible, a testament to the collective pressure of protests, petitions, and her own testimony at the New York City Council hearing. Her advocacy had birthed something larger, a nonprofit she'd founded called Travelers Dignity Network. Launched 2 months ago with seed funding from a civil rights grant, the organization supported victims of airport discrimination, offering legal referrals, counseling, and a platform to share their stories. Aisha had hired a small staff, including Maria from Citizens for Fair Travel, and they were already fielding dozens of cases. The work was grueling. Every email from a victim felt like a fresh wound, but it gave Aisha purpose. She'd found a calling she hadn't sought, one that made the chaos of the past months feel worth it. But the cost had been steep. Her job at the tech firm was gone. The client's withdrawal after the protests had been the final straw, and Karen, her boss, had let her go in August, citing strategic realignment. Aisha had seen it coming, but the blow still stung. She'd loved her work, the challenge of crafting campaigns, the camaraderie of her team. Losing it felt like losing a piece of herself, a reminder of how quickly the world could punish those who spoke out. She'd leaned on Maya during those weeks, spending tearful nights at her friend's apartment, mourning the career she'd built. But Maya, ever fierce, had pushed her forward. "You're doing something bigger than any job," she'd said. "You'll find your way." Aisha had, slowly, channeling her energy into the nonprofit while freelancing to pay the bills. Her family remained a complex anchor. Her parents had come to terms with her activism, their worry tempered by pride. They'd attended the D.C. rally, standing in the crowd as she spoke, their faces a mix of awe and fear. Afterward, her mother had hugged her tightly, whispering, "You're stronger than I ever was." Her father, less vocal, had mailed her a framed photo of the rally, a quiet gesture of support. Aisha kept it on her desk, a reminder of their love, even when their fears clashed with her resolve. They still called weekly, urging her to stay safe, but the tension had eased, replaced by a fragile understanding. The online world was quieter now. Though not silent, the hate had dwindled after Reynolds's firing and the TSAS reforms. But pockets of vitriol persisted. Aisha had hired a cybersecurity firm to scrub her personal information from doxing sites, and Sarah had won a small settlement against the tabloid that smeared her college activism. Supporters outnumbered detractors, their messages a steady drumbeat of gratitude. A high school in Chicago had invited her to speak at a civics class, and a community center in Brooklyn had named a scholarship after her. Aisha accepted these honors humbly, still uncomfortable with her hero status. She wasn't a hero, just a woman who'd refused to stay silent. Her personal life was a work in progress. The relentless pace of the past months had strained her friendships, and she was rebuilding those bonds. She and Maya had resumed their brunches, laughing over pancakes and bad TV recaps, a return to normalcy Aisha cherished. She'd started dating again, cautiously. A software engineer named Samir who'd reached out after seeing her DC speech. Their first date, at a quiet sushi bar, had been a revelation. 2 hours of easy conversation, no mention of airports or protests. It was early, but Samir's calm presence was a balm, a reminder that she could still carve out space for joy. Therapy had become a lifeline. Aisha's sessions twice a month helped her navigate the trauma of the incident, the doxing, the job loss. Her therapist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, encouraged her to name her emotions: anger, grief, hope, and to set boundaries with her work. Aisha was learning to say no, to delegate, to rest. She'd taken up running again, her sneakers pounding the Charles River path at dawn, the rhythm of meditation. These small acts, cooking, running, laughing with Maya, were her rebellion against the chaos. Proof she could reclaim her life. The movement faced challenges. The TSAS reforms were a start, but reports of profiling persisted, and the federal bill was stalled in committee, bogged down by partisan gridlock. Some activists argued for more aggressive tactics, disruptive protests, boycotts, while others, including Aisha, favored sustained pressure through policy and public awareness. The tension had sparked debates within Citizens for Fair Travel, and Aisha mediated where she could, urging unity. "We're stronger together," she told Jamal during a late-night call. "We can't let them divide us." Jamal agreed, but the cracks were a reminder that movements, like people, were fragile. Aisha's nonprofit was her focus now. Travelers Dignity Network had secured a second grant, enough to hire a policy analyst to lobby for the federal bill. Aisha was planning a national conference for next spring, a space for victims to connect and strategize. She'd been invited to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Forum in Geneva, a surreal opportunity she was still processing. The work was daunting, but it felt right, a way to channel her anger and grief into something lasting. That morning, as she sipped her tea, Aisha reflected on the journey. The video had been a spark, but the fire belonged to thousands of protesters, petitioners, victims who'd found their voices. She thought of Reynolds, now a footnote, his firing a small justice in a larger fight. She thought of the Dallas man who'd reported his profiling, the Atlanta woman whose video had gone viral, the countless others whose stories she carried. Their courage fueled her, a reminder that change was a collective act, built on shared resolve. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "NYC Council just passed a resolution for an airport oversight board. Your testimony sealed it." Aisha smiled, her heart lifting. The resolution was local, but it set a precedent, a model for other cities. She replied, "Amazing. Thank you for everything." Sarah's response was quick. "You started this. Keep going." Aisha set the phone down, her eyes drifting to the photo of the DC rally on her desk. She'd been terrified that day, but she'd spoken anyway, and the world had listened. As the sun climbed higher, Aisha stepped inside, her tea mug empty. She opened her laptop, where a draft speech for the Geneva Forum waited. She'd write about dignity, about the right to move through the world without fear, about the power of one voice to spark a chorus. The words would come slowly, as they always did, but they'd come. She thought of her parents, Maya, Samir, the strangers who'd stood with her. She thought of the road ahead, uncertain, arduous, but hers to walk. Aisha began typing, the clatter of keys a quiet defiance. The fight wasn't over, and neither was she. She'd carry the movement forward, not as a hero but as a woman who'd chosen to act, whose stand had reshaped lives, systems, and her own heart. The sunrise stretched across the city, and Aisha wrote, her story now a beacon for others to follow.